Hey, everybody. Hope you're enjoying Global Supply Chain Week. My name is Greg Miller. I'm a senior editor with FreightWaves and American Shipper. And I am joined by Peter Friedmann, the executive director of the Agriculture Transportation Coalition, or AGTC. Peter, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Greg, for having us.
Yeah, so Peter and I wish we could speak about a happier subject, but we are here today to talk about the extreme challenges that are being faced by U.S. exporters of food and containerized agricultural products. But before we get to that, Peter, if you could just talk briefly about what AgTC is and what it does.
Sure. The Agriculture Transportation Coalition was formed three decades ago because U.S. agriculture exporters were facing a common problem. That is, there's nothing that we produce in agriculture, or forest products for that matter, here in the United States that cannot be sourced somewhere else in the world. And if we can't deliver it affordably, dependably, to the foreign customers, those foreign customers will go somewhere else in the world and we lose those markets. Our agriculture products do not have brand names. They do not have a swoosh or stripes. So our ag exports are fungible. We can lose those markets and we're completely dependent on affordable, dependable transportation to get our agriculture and forest products overseas. That's what we're here for.
All right. Well, let's get to the big problem at hand, the exports and the challenges there. And just as a bit of backdrop, let me explain. The container system, the global container system, is now in a state of crisis. COVID has upended consumer demand patterns in a way that was not foreseen. The amount of money that people used to spend on services and travel has been redirected to buying goods, and fiscal stimulus has supported their continued buying of goods. So we're seeing this unprecedented surge of consumer demand for containerized products. And the carriers would say that there are not enough ships on the water right now, and there are not enough containers in position right now to serve all of this demand. And so what we started to hear back in October, November, was that some carriers had decided, given the need for containers, that they would bring more containers empty from the West Coast over to China to refill them for more lucrative headhaul trades, as opposed to filling those containers with U.S. exports. Peter, I mean, your members are right in the middle of this. If you could just go back and explain, what your members have seen with this issue over the last few months and how it's evolved.
This issue has evolved for certain over the last few months with COVID. However, it's a little too easy for the ocean carriers and the terminals to blame everything on COVID and the new world, because we are finding that some of the most incredible burdens, cost burdens that have been imposed on U.S. exporters actually had their roots in actions by the carriers and the terminals in the years leading up to our COVID crisis. Currently, ocean carriers can receive from importers for freight, $8, $10, and I heard yesterday $12,000 freight charges or freight revenue for imports from Vietnam to California-based ports. I know the published rate and the tariff rate is something more like 6 to 8, but if you actually want your cargo on the ship, it'll be maybe closer to 10 to 12,000. That's coming in. Going out, our exports traditionally are lower margin. As I mentioned before, they're fungible. They have maybe a value of the delivered container of hay of $12,000 to $14,000. So a freight rate that is $12,000 to $14,000, obviously would put an end to that trade. So traditionally, exports have paid significantly less. They have paid typically $500, $600, but ocean carriers have always seen that the head haul across the Pacific is where they get their revenue, and then they got to get those containers back. We have an almond exporter. Carriers said, we can't carry your exports back. We can't carry, we need the container because it goes back faster, empty. We're going to just not carry your export. This almond exporter said, well, how much do you need? And the guy said, the exporter or the carrier said, well, the $150 you're paying us for freight to carry the almonds across the Pacific is not enough. The almond exporter said, we never asked for that low rate. Ocean carriers have always seen us, the U.S. ag exporters, as just the backhaul to get the containers back. They have to go back, and if they can get some revenue, they'll get the revenue. But in fact, ocean carriers are now finding they can increase the freight rates on our exports back to Asia. They can make more money, and maybe it justifies them carry that container loaded with freight. But still, they're not going to get more than $500, $600, $700 for that container of hay, almonds, lumber, rice, all the products we export, soybeans, going back across the Pacific. That they have to get those containers back. It is also true that agriculture is no longer grown. Citrus farms are no longer grown in the city of Los Angeles. It's inland into the Central Valley, inland to the potato growing areas of Idaho, inland to the pork and beef processors in Kansas, Nebraska, and so forth. So to take a container all the way to Kansas from a port in Los Angeles, for example, and then load it and bring it all the way back to Los Angeles to load out, that container is sort of taken out of service, if you will. So we can understand the carriers say, forget it. We don't want to lose container. We'll lose the revenue, but we'll get our container back faster to Asia. The fact is, the Chinese government stepped in about a month and a half ago when the ocean carriers announced yet another general rate increase, Trans-Pacific eastbound import cargo into the U.S. The Chinese government said, no, that $800 GRI you announced, you're not going to do it. And the next day, it was rescinded because China is looking out after its exports, which are consumer goods coming in. China has since imposed on ocean carriers restrictions on the rates that they can charge coming out of China to the U.S. They're protecting their exports. The United States, we believe, needs to protect its exports, and we are finding, based on the articles appearing in major national publications on this, on the crisis for exports, not being able to get loaded and going out, we have a number of members of Congress who are set to take action, and some already are communicating their views. This is a crisis.
Now let me ask you, though, how bad is it right now in terms of U.S. exporters in the hinterland? What are you hearing in terms of these exporters, and are they actually not able to get container loads out? Are their foods spoiling? Are they losing sales? How bad is the situation right now for your members?
All agriculture essentially is from the hinterland. It depends whether hinterland's 2 hours from the coast or whether it's 1,000 miles in from the coast. And it is terrible. Terrible being defined as losing sales, losing customers, when losing profits because you got to pay significant penalties when you don't deliver on time on delivery contracts. That's one. Secondly, ocean carriers have, in the words of Gene Soroka, the Port of Los Angeles, weaponized detention and demurrage charges. Those are the charges for containers dwelling at the port or the containers staying out of the port, not being returned in time. And those charges are amounting in aggregate to millions of dollars weekly for agriculture and forest products exporters when there are no appointments at terminals, when the ocean carriers do not give an accurate or even close to accurate earliest return date. Their schedules are so far off, the carrier tells the exporter of dry dairy powder from Kansas, get your container here to the port because these are your days you can load your container on our ship. And guess what? The ship doesn't arrive. The carrier doesn't even bother to tell the customer. They have to find out from the terminal when they get there. And then the carrier charges them detention demurrage charges for some products, $125 a day per container for the delay in returning it. For other, it's $375 a day. That's the charge for that container sitting at the terminal or the container not even being returned to the terminal because there are not even appointments available to get it back in. Those charges that, as Gene says, weaponizing as a major source of freight revenue, demurrage and detention charges, began several years before COVID. COVID has exacerbated the situation, but it did not begin. And we have communications, oral communications from some carriers that demurrage and detention charges, which after all are charges when the system is not flowing smoothly, amounting to 20% of the annual freight revenue projections of the carriers. That is an indication the carriers are expecting that this congestion, the delay, often caused by the carriers themselves, by failing to provide dates upon which the ships will arrive at the ports, the dates that the ships are available for loading.
Let me just ask you here, though. Let me ask you. The California government has recently written to the FMC, and they've requested that the FMC look at suspending and reducing detention and demurrage charges, cancellation of port congestion surcharges, improved notification of empty container receiving locations, and commencement of rulemaking related to detention and demurrage charges. And within a very short period of time of that letter coming out, the World Shipping Council and the Pacific Merchant Shipping Association came out and said that the adoption of these protocols would make congestion worse by, if you suspend and reduce the charges, you disincentivize cargo interests from moving the cargo off, you create more congestion. So what would you say about this rebuttal?
This rebuttal is old and tired, like everything else the World Shipping Council says to the Federal Maritime Commission before it takes action. The World Shipping Council said when demurrage and detention was going to be undertaken by Commissioner Rebecca Dye as a major initiative to issue guidelines as to what would be reasonable practices, port practices for detention, demurrage. The World Shipping Council said the FMC does not have authority to act in this area. So here they're saying to you, lately they're saying, well, it would be counterproductive. Otherwise, they say it doesn't have authority. Well, guess what? The FMC ignored the World Shipping Council, as it should, and because the Federal Maritime Commission is charged under the Shipping Act to look out for the interest of U.S. shippers. Okay, that's what it's supposed to do. And so what they did is moved ahead with the detention demurrage guidelines, even though World Shipping Council said they didn't have the authority. They moved ahead, they issued those guidelines. And what is happening now is that the next step is those guidelines will ultimately be made into statutory prohibited acts. In other words, if somebody violates the guidelines, an ocean carrier, there will be significant penalties, including suspension of the carrier's tariffs for consistent violation of what we know as guidelines now, but which will be required, or if you violate them, prohibited acts. There are numerous prohibited acts in the Shipping Act. The guidelines will translate into those and they'll be enforced. Now, this notion that we need to charge these fees in order to incentivize, that's an old song, Greg. You've heard it for decades. We need to incentivize. When I hear this from a president of Ocean Carrier, they tell the assembled exporters or importers, we need to charge you these fees to move your cargo through faster. I ask, is there anybody in this room who wants the cargo to move slower? In fact, people are losing customers because the cargo isn't moving fast enough because the carriers and terminals can't, won't, don't take the actions they need to take. I will give you a specific example. When you go to the airport, your phone the whole time is buzzing because the airline's telling you every time the flight's going to be 3 minutes delayed, or if it moves to another gate. All the way through, you're getting these text messages. Thousands and thousands and thousands of customers are getting those in real time. Could the ocean carriers bother to tell a customer the day they leave the port, the last port in China, and come to the US to go to Los Angeles? Is it too much to ask the ocean carriers to provide at least that information? I'm not even asking them to provide an accurate day when they'll actually arrive, which they should be able to, but they got 2 weeks. Do you think they could provide? They don't. And instead, they benefit. Ocean carriers are profiting by the congestion they're causing. They're benefiting by the detention and demurrage revenue, which in many cases, and particularly on exports, is greater. It surpasses the freight charges, the actual freight charges. So we want to disincentivize the ocean carriers from creating this congestion delay, because right now this congestion delay is generating massive revenue for them. If they were not able to get the revenue, as the California letter proposes, that there would not be this revenue from detention and demurrage, we believe that carriers and terminals would work effectively to eliminate much of the congestion and delay. They would invest in the technology to even bother to tell a customer when the ship is going to arrive, which they don't do now.
So basically your main point though would be that the carriers would say that, if you look at the Shipping Act, the word reasonable, if you look at the crisis because of COVID, if you look at the sudden change that no one has seen, that they're doing their best. And what you're saying is that's not true at all, that the carriers are part of the problem, and that that there would need to be some form of government intervention to solve this problem, or at least carriers changing their ways.
Well, the Shipping Act is government invention, always has. So the carriers are saying the Shipping Act works fine as it is. Well, that is government intervention. The fact is that the government and the Federal Maritime Commission, very frankly, they have the authority under the Shipping Act to take the action. You don't need legislation to change the Shipping Act to provide the FMC with authority to determine what's a reasonable practice and what's not. The guidelines were issued. I think the ocean carriers and the terminals were very poorly advised by lawyers or lobbyists or whoever the heck is advising them to ignore the FMC's guidelines entirely. As every commissioner will tell you, the carriers and the terminals ignored every single one of the guidelines that they spent a year and a half developing. So now those commissioners, no surprise to anyone, are saying, well, we told them it's optional. Here's some guidelines to show you what we would believe is reasonable. But if you're choosing not to, if you're the carrier and you're choosing not to take advantage of that guidance that the commission's given you, then you're going to be at the mercy of some pretty upset commissioners, upset exporters, upset governors, upset congressmen, upset senators. Now there's some systematic issues too. The ocean carriers have created the alliances. We used to have 21 ocean carriers across the Pacific. Now we have 9. There's less competition. The big ships are too big for many of the terminals on the West Coast. Those are other issues which
no, I mean it's an incredibly complex problem, and it's an important issue, and it's an ongoing one now. And I wish we could talk about this all day, but Peter, I really again appreciate you taking the time to speak with us. If anyone needs to reach out to you, how can they reach you?
They can send an email easily. Send it not to me. Send it to info, INFO, like information, info at agtrans, like agriculture transportation.org. That way, several of us will see it. Info at agtrans.org. And I thank everybody for putting up with my enthusiasm and passion.
It's been great, Peter. It's been great, Peter. It's always good to talk to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Greg. You always ask the hard and the right questions.
Okay.